Oh no, I have
No.
I have no problem with that at all. I just don't want to hold you up to continue to I feel like they're just always sick of hearing about me. No, I mean I know they're humanists, so they tolerate it, but they more than tolerate it. But anyway, yeah, it's fine. I certainly have time. Happy to do answer whatever I can.
Okay, well, let me ask you a couple of questions. One that I'm curious about, having just arrived here and beginning to look around and kind of get a sense of New Orleans on this weekend. How would you describe? I mean, one of the things we talked about before is the local specificity of what is basically a national crisis, and each locality takes on its own tone. And obviously, the elephant in the room here in New Orleans is Katrina. Can you talk a little bit about the relationship between what's happening now nationally and what happened here 5 years ago? Is it even relevant to talk about the national collapse of 2008 in this environment, or is it still really just about Katrina?
That's a good question. I probably frame it or approach it the other way, which is I feel that Katrina revealed great strengths in the population that were not known entirely to the people here or to the nation. And we have a post-colonial society with weak governance, weak public institutions. We didn't receive a lot of good leadership at the mayoral, the state, or the federal level, either in personal planning or ideas or the finances of things. But what New Orleanians fell back on was the need to be in the place together, to continue with the things, the way of life they appreciated, with the great traditions of food and of music and carnival, and a sense of the joie de vivre. And even for people that don't have much, the family kitchen garden or going out to the bayou to get something to eat, and the appreciation people do, I think, have here of other cultures among us that are commingled, creolized, and at the same time distinguished in a good sense. Not to say that people weren't aware of and that there aren't problems of crime, violence, terrible poverty, drug use, and of course the weak public education system. Bad governance sort of mentioned that. I think Alan Toussaint made the comment originally that he thought that Katrina gave us the opportunity in this kind of Christian way to be born again, to roll away the stone, to come out and show we could survive. That there was a sort of resurrection quality thing going. But more recently when we've talked about it, he says, no, it was a baptism into a new life. And so he did use those Christian models. But I think that there is a profound sense here right now that after the very hard days of fall 2005, 2006, much of 2007, and despite weak political leadership, that the social aid and pleasure clubs, the second lines, all the volunteers from around the country and around the world, all kinds of different ways people have come here, 43,000 applications to this school that pre-Katrina was getting 13 or 14,000, post-Katrina dropped to maybe a few thousand, then went back up slightly, and then suddenly it doubled to 17,000, to 34,000, now up to 43. That there's this sense of energy here that's come out of the catastrophe, that the local aesthetic of shared culture, community-based activity, the welcoming of the NGOs that range from things that have been there like Acorn to newer things like Sweet Home New Orleans that focused on the model citizens, the artisans, the building artisans in the trades, people who did plastering and ironwork and bricklaying, the musicians that fill the clubs and the dance halls, the people that make carnival costumes, people that participate in second-line parades and ritual festival occasions like Carnival, that all of them really needed to be back here. And that culture, as much as we might have liked the landscape and rely on it as the place to assemble, but that culture really is in the ability of people's own minds and emotions to act based on what they've learned and what they care about. And so getting people back here was really more important than rebuilding the infrastructure. Mm-hmm. That's not to say we don't need the infrastructure, but I know of no New Orleanian that stayed here, and I know of no tourist that came here or somebody that came here and settled to stay here that came because they thought the infrastructure was great to begin with. However, I can't account for the people that did leave here both before and since Katrina, who were dissatisfied with the lack of decent schools, the lack of decent governance, the lack of roads and bridges and all the other things, and the lack of protection from the levee system. But that said, I think right now the message has been that the intangible culture that everyone wonders about, how we preserve it, continue it into the future. It can't be just rebuilt like an historic house. It's not just a bridge. It's a set of relationships. Suddenly the intangibility of those relationships became paramount. And you could take an old schmaltzy song written on Tin Pan Alley like Do You Know What It Means to Miss New Orleans, written for a movie, with Armstrong and Billie Holiday in the late 40s, that's kind of a tourist standard that locals here kind of, it's in the background, moonlight, magnolias, whatever. Suddenly 1.2 million people did know what it meant to Miss New Orleans, and they came up with their own story about it, and their own story then was shared with everybody else in the newspapers, in the media, with one another when they could finally assemble. So a new conversation about culture emerged here with very strong antecedents, because we had the second lands, we had the music, we had the food, we had the multiple ethnicities in a Creole society, we had the carnival where it's all both made fun of and elevated at the same time. And so we had a lot of deep cultural resources that I think have allowed us to move maybe more profoundly forward as a city than one where all that was done was providing of dollars to rebuild something. And so that's not to say that the rebuilding and the new building of infrastructure, that's a human right, as I would see it. But as I was telling people when the city was in really deep straits and there was still water and bodies everywhere, Venice hasn't been discarded because there's a lot of water in it. Everyone still thinks the buildings are important. Everyone thinks the Opera House is important. Everyone thinks the big square is important. We feel that way about New Orleans, not just the buildings and the Place d'Armes and the river and the cathedral and everything else. We think individual jazz musicians are important. We think social aid and pleasure clubs are important. We think Dookie Chases is important. And the list just goes on and on and on of what people here think is important to their lives. So when you then turn to the national question, we are in a somewhat enviable position that our unemployment rate's about 2.5 points below the national average, partly because of the FEMA money rolling through here, partly because there are a lot of self-starter entrepreneur NGO types, partly because we lost a lot of the people who were least likely to be employed here. And I don't say that as a wonderful or lucky thing. It's just the reality of the demography, that an awful lot of poor, mostly black people, have been able to get better treatment or a better job in Houston, Dallas, Atlanta, or wherever. So the stats look better here in a funny way on the employment question than they're going to look other places in America. And then there is this charged sense that we've come through the worst and we're moving forward. And there's this brain gain that people that come to Tulane, people finished graduate school in law, want to practice here, or somebody that wants to do environmental studies, nonprofit. All these layers and levels of arrivers have filled the population back up to the probably mid 70% total of where it was. And then the old top of it, either the people that resent that there wasn't good enough infrastructure or weren't long-term dwellers in this place for the trauma, or the poorer people who really can't return or have found a better deal elsewhere. That crowd, has not been as essential to this more. If you're here, you're a believer, either the new arrivers or the returners. So when people here look at the national economy, it's like they've been through this. They've been through the oil collapse of the 80s. It's a fairly diversified economy. There's no one strong industry here. I mean, tourism's moved ahead of oil in the last few years. It's never been a smokestack town. There are refineries upriver, but they're not that labor intensive. And so people here feel like they get to live a way of life and have a lot of options. And they don't live at a high level of economy. So as the American economy is going like this, the Louisiana-New Orleans economy has risen a little bit. And maybe there's a convergence point where their vision is an upward hope vision based on culture and how they live, and others is a vision of loss of all the promises that they once had in the old order. So I think I see New Orleans as a kind of a rehearsal, of a psychological rehearsal for what could happen in a lot of cities and towns and villages in America, which is to return to examining what is culturally important to you. Now, I grant you that culture here has often been in quotes. It's been a record industry. It's been an export of one of the great contributions of the world to the vernacular arts, jazz, rhythm and blues, soul music, funk, etc. We have more than some places. We know that now in a new way. We value that in a new way. But I also think we were ready to export that sense of lateral communal action and hope and focusing on what you genuinely have as opposed to what was delivered to you in the strip mall product or from Wall Street or Washington. So there's an interesting thing going. And this university's narrative was, come help a great city recover, learn the culture. Social aid and pleasure are the twin points of the clubs. Students always like pleasure. You could just say, okay, go to a party school. But when it's conjoined to social aid, it means that the enjoyment is to raise money, to assemble the people to be together with one another. In the old days, it was for the benefit of medical help, of burial, dignity, education of not just African Americans and Afro Creoles, but some of the German societies, the Irish and Italian societies, that same kind of thing. But now that has become a writ large principle. Now, I grew up in New England. Social aid was given. Even in conservative towns, like I said, you take care of the poor people, you guard the landscape, you do those things. Pleasure was not foregrounded in my New England world. Yeah, you might go down to the shore where there's a little Italian nightclub or something, but that was all very marginalized, you know. But here, pleasure is seen as its own reward. Play is understood as valuable, and I think in a funny way, on the ground, people have worked out that set of relationships. It doesn't mean everybody in the suburbs or everybody uptown, everyone at Tulane gets that. Tulane fights its own issues of being trying to be like an Ivy League school without an Ivy League endowment. And I pushed Tulane away from the Protestant work ethic and that sense of ascendancy in America. And I say, take cultural riches and for once translate the cliche into economic riches by helping figure out who are the great voices here, who are the great doers here, not just the musicians. Bring them to campus, let them lecture, figure out, do we do a fashion industry? Let's start tackling this stuff with what we've got. So I'm not saying that there aren't people unemployed and there aren't many, but so many people have come here lately from Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico to help rebuild the city. And there are social fractions and there are fractioning points, and there's obviously terrible crime sadnesses in the murder rates among young drug dealing kids that go on just constantly here. But there still seems to be something larger that everyone feels part of through the art. And it's not an imposed art of a big fancy symphony hall. It's not the imposed art of you've got the greatest museum in the world, and if you'll do that, everyone will come to your downtown. It just, if comes up out of all these neighborhoods and cultures that have long been here together in pain and pleasure. And there's a greater sense of unity post-disaster in what we can do together than I have seen in all the years I've been in Louisiana. So I'm fairly optimistic about a lot of this stuff. I don't know where it's going to go, but I find it fascinating that hipsters from all over the country seem to want to come here and stay here. True. So anyway, there's days I despair about things and I wish they went better, and there's days I wish we had a better totality of continuity for how we govern things. But I guess I see the role of government right here and anywhere as more like creating freedom for people to do things that they'd like to hope and dream to do.
Yeah. In that context, can you talk a little bit about Obama, both candidate Obama but also President Obama, in a context where, for some racial reasons and also for what I would suspect would be a very understandable kind of anti-Bush animus that existed here, maybe even more so than other parts of the country,
right? Especially in the city.
Yeah. What's been the experience of the election cycle and then on into the early Obama administration?
Well, if you look at Louisiana as a whole, Obama lost by quite a bit. I think he got high 20s, low 30s of the vote. So it was a wipeout. If you look at New Orleans, it went about 8 or 9 to 1 the other way.
Right.
That said, I think within old guard Republican New Orleans, there was a huge dissatisfaction with the Bush administration over promises made under the clique lights in Jackson Square and the use of the metaphor of the jazz funeral back, I guess it was November. And then 45 days later, when some congressional authorization was running out for helping the recovery, he wasn't there standing supporting it, and it took, somebody in Iowa saying, wait a minute, that's New Orleans. I went there on my honeymoon, or my kid's in school there, or I love Louis Armstrong, or something about the cultural agency of the place affecting the outside world. So, yeah, there was the rose of George Bush in that era was pretty well wilted by Brownie and You're Doing a Fine Job and all the mess that ensued from that. That said, basically, this city is going to vote in the more democratic direction. I think that a lot of people were certainly Afro-Americans, Afro-Creoles, people of color in general were thrilled with Obama's ascendancy. And there were second lines, with his placards, and many of the local juke joints and nightclubs had election day, gatherings, election eve gatherings, watching the returns, in bars all around the city, and celebrations into the night, with fireworks and music and all the things that New Orleans, brass bands and stuff does. So I'd say the celebration here was really, really intense, and I think a lot of moderate white, more conservative Democrats felt that way as well, and I think there's just generally been a pride in how that happened, and a pride in Obama. I think there's a perplexed quality by people here, where we used to have quite an aggressive public health system based on Huey Long's era of charity hospitals, and now we're closing this hospital was this palace of medicine, and LSU's trying to build this big new fancy sort of suburban hospital in a neighborhood that was going to be destroyed basically to do it. And people are wondering, is that the answer to get rid of our great old charity hospital? And there's a lot of people that feel badly about that, even people that don't need the charity hospital care. So I think there's some ambivalence about how it's all going. We have a very conservative senator who's had his dalliances and been brought morally down, David Vitter, but not so far morally down that he can't continue to probably win the election. And then we have Mary Lander, who walks a very tight line between being progressive enough to support a woman's right to choose in a Catholic culture in the southern part of the state, but has difficulty being very forceful about a whole lot that you might consider progressive. I think people, particularly people of color here, are still extremely proud of Obama and his ascendancy. And I think there's the same animus and concern about how he's being treated in Washington as they would have for, Baton Rouge and rural people and upstate people that think New Orleans is, a jungle and an ungovernable, place that's not worth being taken care of by the taxpayers of the rest of the state. So, there's that. I think Obama's loss of focus and credibility has been a source of discouragement to people here, just like everywhere else, probably.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Can you say, last question, you mentioned your boyhood in New England. Can you talk a little bit about where you grew up and how you came to do the thing that you do? Why are you following people
If I ask you that question, you
you
can ask me that question. Well, my father was born in Germany. His mother was Jewish. His father was Protestant. Actually, his father was from a Protestant family that had become Catholic. His father was a Zeppelin engineer for the Kaiser. His mother was an Adler from a high caste German Jewish family. She converted to Catholicism in Germany. They had a funeral for her in her family. My dad was raised Catholic, and we were raised Catholic at a time when Catholics were told they better raise their kids Catholic. My mother was high church Protestant, Episcopalian from an old first family of Virginia, Randolphs, but they had left Virginia prior to the Civil War because they were abolitionists. They kept that memory alive of their connection to Jefferson and Edmund and John Randolph, but they were abolitionists who ended up working in the then Silicon Valley kind of Paterson, New Jersey, and the garments and the making of fashion. Her mother was a suffragette and a hat maker, a milliner. My mother was a very expansive American thinker who, wanted us to read our Walt Whitman and understand Jefferson, but would be just as happy taking us down to Greenwich Village at night when I was a little kid and say, those are the beatniks and they make poetry and art and they're really great people. Or take us up to Harlem, and say that's the Savoy Ballroom and Duke Ellington played there and he was from Washington. In other words, she was always filling us in on stuff like that and always very hopeful and inclusive. My dad was much more of a scientist. He went to Columbia in the 1920s when it was the leading science university, probably in America, and one of the leading ones in the world. His parents saw in Weimar the impending problems in Germany, and they wanted their son to go to America. And he was a chemist. And when he got his first job, somebody asked him if he was Jewish. He said no, and they asked him what are the holy days of obligation, basically anti-Semitism in the corporate setting, and it very much upset him because he wasn't unsympathetic to his mother. He managed to go back right after Kristallnacht and try to convince his parents to get out of Germany, and he succeeded in convincing them of that, and he got them to get boat tickets, and they boiled down their possessions. They were well off into gold bullion, and they put it in their shoes. And on the gangplank of one of the last commercial liners to leave, his father died of a heart attack. Obviously, stress. And I mean, come on, you're leaving your homeland. All this. They pretended like everything was just a family trip. It was going to be just a family vacation. So they spent the requisite time to settle the affairs, et cetera. And then he got his mother to come with him, and he spent enough time in Germany making that happen, that in Berlin, that when he got to New York, there was a draft notice from the Fuhrer that had been forwarded to him. And he tried to join the U.S. Army when war broke out, but they wouldn't take him because he was a naturalized citizen. They questioned his loyalty. After D-Day, they needed people who could speak German, and he could speak German and Dutch and French and some Russian. And so he ended up being a translator interrogator as the Allies crossed Europe. He ended up back in Berlin and Frankfurt, where he'd grown, and saw the results of firebombing and all those things. And even though he carried with him an enormous respect for Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, Goethe, all those things, he had been deeply hurt by the role of the Catholic Church in the war's lack of willingness to call out, what was happening in the death camps. And so even though he regaled us with tales of folk tales and music and all those things, he never went back to Germany after that. And I say that as a measure against my mother, because I think that both of them were people with a profound sense of a great civilization that had once been in their life, the old Virginia, or in my dad's case, old German ascendant literature, art, Europe, and that both of them had been tragically lost. And so I grew up with older parents who always made me think about the past in our present moment. In a small town in Connecticut where we relocated when I was 7, he was a scientist, chemist for Pfizer. And we were outsiders in that we were part of the new technocrat class, mm-hmm. but my mother had this sense of noblesse oblige about everything. I always said, Mom, we have a lot of oblige, but not much noblesse. But I just got in. I always hung out, didn't go to prep school. I went to a good public school. I always liked all the backwoods Connecticut people that made possum pie. I went to the county fairs. I liked the differences of all the cultures. I didn't have a big class affiliation with the old English guard of the Griswolds, or the people that gave money to Yale. The Hill Houses were there and things like that. So, I started looking for America inside the diversity of its people and its classes without thinking about it. And when I finally was in college, I went to the Wharton School for a semester and dropped out. In 1968, it didn't seem very cool to be in Wharton, but my dad had convinced me I needed to be a business person and make all this money to float them all later in life. I transferred into anthropology, and even anthropology was dissatisfying to me, though, because it seemed like it was always exotic and other, and I wanted to know what's going on in Philadelphia. And that's when I met Zwed, and he was doing, I'd been at the sociology department saying, look, I want to do stuff on the street singers down on South Street. I want to go to the black church and record that. And they said, well, the only thing we're doing in the black community is, we're focusing on matrifocal families, alcoholism, domestic violence. I said, well, I'm going out to the Aqua Lounge, and I see Coltrane's old bandmates playing this spiritual jazz. Half of them are wearing little suits and ties, half are wearing dashikis. But where's that in the sociology department's vision of the black culture? Wasn't in the anthro department, wasn't in sociology. American studies was still in Mark Twain, Weathervanes, literature, right. Dreiser, et cetera. And Zwed, under folklore, was doing the kind of informal vernaculars of jazz, including the avant-garde, not just the New Orleans where it feels communal and feels like a folk group. And Zwed just blew my mind, and we did ethnography, field work in Philly, and I had to titularly major in anthro, but I did my work in Philly, and I worked on rock radio. I'd been the head of the radio station there back when students ran it, and I felt like all the human relations area files of the world that were sitting in the Anthropology Museum could not compare to me to the grooves of the Folkways records, the Arhulis, the Okoras, of the world cultures on the wall of one little record library. And so I got into radio and producing and presenting the archive filtered through an aesthetic I was developing. And I did underground radio for a few years in Philly, and then I would say, after a few years of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, I began to think, I wasn't supposed to only do this. My mother was sort of in my mind like, Nick, you need to help America get better. And my dad was like, you need to be more organized, more focused, more studious. So I went to graduate school, but I didn't major in any language that he would have approved of. I got involved with Creole and Creolization and the mingling of culture to create new culture. Working in Louisiana, worked for the state I went from being a tourist to a hippie traveler, tourist, bureaucrat, state official finally, and grad student, and did that for 7 years. Went to the Smithsonian for 5 as a federal, editing other people's work. Got discouraged by the bureaucracy. Started becoming indie. Became a concert artistic director, Carnegie Hall, Wolf Trap, presenting traditional arts and culture, and saying it didn't all have to be out in the field. Let's tackle the proscenium stage with Mardi Gras Indians, with the blues, with all these things. Let's take the institutions we've been given by this world and figure out how to use them for the advantage of the cultures and communities out there to, accrue the prestige. And so, I've always sort of been involved in that looking for the great voices and visions of the vernacular and finding new ways to do it. And I didn't come to back to Louisiana to be here at Tulane. But I came here to do American Roots, which was I'd given radio up for 10 years, and I thought, I can do this. I know enough music. I know enough artists. This would be good economically and culturally for this place. I speak the languages necessary, and so I did it at UNO, which is UNO is kind of like the University of New Haven. It's a very public institution. It gets people ready to be employed. But I had real good grad students and some very motivated undergrads. I taught a little here. And then Tulane decided that they would make a leap and bring a guy who was a vernacular humanities guy over here instead of, they'd always get somebody, from Yale or Penn or Oxford or Cambridge or somewhere else, And so that was gratifying to me that they would take the guy that grew through the field library, as it were, rather than the traditional scholarly methods. And then they sent me a letter of agreement that never arrived because it was mailed 2 days before Katrina hit. It was mailed on the Friday. 3 days, and it was never found. And so I didn't come here in 2005. I was getting ready to leave after returning. We evacuated ourselves. We went elsewhere. We came back. We all were involved, the whole staff here, my family, everyone, and kind of come back, recover. And I visited other places in the country, North Carolina and Brown and Bowdoin. And I actually had some friends at Yale, too. Zwed was still there then. I just didn't feel I could go those places, and I thought it would be better for me to do what I could do here. And a new provost came in. This whole new brain gain brought people here who finally could say looked at Tulane and said the narrative has been help a great American city recover, get involved in the culture. Well, then they needed faculty that knew something about that. Yeah. So they came back to me for a third time. They'd actually offered me a job once before. And I thought, I'm going to do this. So I decided that come to a private university where the credibility of being on the contiguous landscape, doing all this field work over all these many years, was the way I could get my way into teaching, and then presenting how I represented culture in 5 or 6 different vehicles that I've tried to use, and the ups and downs of them. And so that leads us to the current moment. We're 11 years into American Roots, which started at UNO, and then Tulane built me this little studio here, and we continue with it.
Uh-huh. When you
that's a kind of a long-winded, but that's the best I can do it in about 5 minutes.
That's great. Well, when you narrate your parents' lives, one is struck by, you must have grown up with whatever form it took. You grew up with a pretty huge dose of kind of diaspora and dispossession.
Totally.
And I'm wondering how you understand that as an inheritance that you've taken with you, whether it's in the intellectual work that you do, right, or your attachment to New Orleans and your decision not to run.
All those all those things have relevance. I think I didn't feel we had my father had maiden aunties that taught French that were Adlers in New York, and so my Jewish family connections are like a dream sequence in my life from age 2 to 6 when we'd visit Oaks and we'd visit Adlers and teachers and people, the liquor distributor here and somebody there, and we'd go up to the Catskills for some weekend. We didn't celebrate any Jewish holidays, but we celebrated our kinfolk. And my father stayed in touch with his mother's aunts and great aunts and uncles, and then their offspring in America. And they had looked after him when they were younger, and he was a student at Columbia. And so we knew them. But it was a dream. And I never felt, I thought that some of them seemed a little odd. They spoke with a Yiddish accent or German accent, or only in German or Yiddish. And so to me as a kid, they seemed a little odd, but they were nice and sweet to me and always making me mittens and giving me chocolates and everything. It was only later when I was like maybe about 10 in Old Lyman, I sort of bragged that I was 1/4 Jewish, that some kid said to me, well, you need to only be 1/8 Indian to get put on the reservation, which in post the 1950s, there was an enormous anti-kraut thing going, and my dad spoke with an accent, and the distinction between who was Jewish and who was in the Reich and all that was all mixed up in kids' minds. You didn't know, but I suddenly started to feel like I'm not. I mean, I knew my mom made it clear to me, even though we have this Virginia heritage, we're not the Griswolds on Griswold Point with 13 generations sitting out there. And a kid I went to school with, this I won't name his last name, but it was tied to a Yale family actually, and this kid was just incapable of anything, and he went to Yale because they'd given millions, and it's not just Yale; it just happened to be nearby where we lived,
right?
But anyway, so I began to feel the whole world started to collapse of how wonderful and merit-like everything was. And the Vietnam War comes, and you get songs like "When the Truth is Found to Be Lies, the joy within you dies." And I was out on the soccer field one day, and I saw a really bad call, and the Jefferson Airplane song is spinning in my mind, and I'm thinking, that was a lie. And all of this around us is a lie. And, by the time I get to college, bombs are flying and guns were shooting and Vietnam was roaring. And I just kind of left a lot of that small town New England sense of we can solve it all with a town meeting behind. And I will say I felt, conflicted about my parents' different identities by then. And I think I went searching for America. I read On the Road, and I go downtown Philly to meet Italians and blacks. And I saw all the privileged kids in college, and I thought, well, what the fuck? All the stuff I like is on these records, blues and jazz and country music. Now I like country music, and even though the country music followers were reactionary against hippies and made comments and get trouble, I still like the music, and I still thought there was good in all the people. That was my mother in me. Always thinks everyone's really good at some level. So, and over the years, I think landing in Louisiana and New Orleans, people here have always affirmed to me to be yourself. Even rural young Creole kids, when I'd learned the language and how to dance and hang out and everything, they'd always say, you don't need to be a Creole. You're not going to be us, man. He's like, do what you can read, you can write a grant, you can take pictures. And so they said, you should help us with that, because we can't do that. If you want to hang out here and be important, you got to do that, And that was a good advice to me. Don't go native, basically. Yeah. Because natives accept you for who you are in this town. Carnival accepts the stranger on the road if it's a good stranger. So anyway, I think New Orleans has been good for me, because that's what I was hinting at, is you can be a religious Creole here, yeah, or a cultural Creole, and you can make fun of it, you can despair about it, but you can fit in, and you can be so-called mixed race, you can fit in. People don't question that here. It doesn't mean there aren't some status and meanings. There are those things, but there isn't that sort of edge on it. There's a niche for a lot of different people here that they can creatively find, and so that's been great for me to live here, and I think that's what called me back post Katrina and post Katrina as things have gotten better, and I'm as gratified as anybody. But I'm not a Tulane because I fought my way up the middle in 3 yards of dust and did all the publications and traditional self-authored books, and I love all that and appreciate it. And maybe I'll do some of that now, but more because I could articulate some of the things in the social order that the students needed, the institution needed. And I could treat this as a city-state where we've got to figure out how to engage this cultural set of discourses that's not the classic academic discourse, but still has high intellectual value, aesthetic value, and meaning to this place financially as well as morally. And so that's been interesting, Yeah. And we're not successful at it every day. Having the show is good because the show demonstrates creativity and research and action and employability for students and visibility for the university. So it gives me a certain coin that I'm happy to have, and it's what I do. It's my identity is to be an interlocutor and a convener of voices and creator of syntheses that model what I might like to see in the social order through segues. Right. So I'm happy with that.
Uh-huh. How do you judge how you're doing?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there really aren't that many parallel activities and ways to judge. Well, I mean, I guess I go for these sort of big coups. Being brought in as a full professor with tenure seems to be important. We get major grants. We get a lot of letters of support. A lot of people come up to me wherever I go and just say, I love the show. Thank you so much for playing that. I've had people say, we're from a mixed race family in Philadelphia. We love that you play blues and we love country. We so appreciate you playing all that, and it's all together and it makes us feel happy. And Oh, I get a lot of benefit out of that sort of thing. But I don't know. I don't know how to evaluate what success is anymore. It's certainly
Right.
not what it was portrayed to me when I went to the Wharton School or even when I finished graduate school.
Right. Well, it sounds like, I mean, you now have a body of work that you can feel the kind of cumulative weight of it.
I don't always self-appreciate it, though. I mean, I would rather will myself to take all my old field reports and turn it into a book on creolization overnight, or even take all of our essays and put them into some books. Not essays, interviews, and some of that will happen. But I think I do still feel like I swim against the tide, even though I'm arguably more at the center of this universe than I ever was. Because Tulane used to be famously resistant to dealing with local culture. I mean, it's like my friend Andy Horowitz that ran, maybe you know Andy.
Yeah.
I mean, he used to gripe, he's Jewish, he's from New Haven, he's like the only representation of New Haven at Yale, he said. And I said, I would really believe Yale talking about the recovery. I say this as a Connecticut person. I said, I want to see Yale figure out how to make Bridgeport, work. They did it up in Lowell.
Right.
I want to see Yale do that one. Brag about that. Don't tell me about some project someplace else in the world or some high theory that you come up with. You show me what you can do for Bridgeport, and I'll be a real believer. And, of course, all my friends at Yale laugh when I say stuff like that. But I say, come on.
Or cry.
Yeah, or cry, right. I mean, I read some signs on campus about how the colors of Benton's arrival was, this emblematic of the great recovery of New Haven. I'm thinking, oh, you got to, no, who believes that? But and I could say the same thing about Penn. I could say the same thing about this place. But this place had to deal with a $500 million loss and the potential loss of the whole city.
Right.
I mean, and so they've gone through a conversion experience to what are we going to do now? What do we really have? And it's not complete and whole, but the forces have moved in a direction that favors some of the things I would have always argued for, but never had a chance to articulate from the center.
Yeah.
So I think my biggest problem in evaluating my success is that I'm sort of at the center, and I don't know quite what that means. Like you said comfortably that you received all these proposals for public humanities, and I probably would have looked at them all and thought, wow, this is really happening. What's left for me to do now? Okay, they're there. Fine, And that's sort of how I feel here. It's like a lot is happening that I don't feel I need to be the field worker anymore. I feel like my job is to be a crossroads convener rather than a guy that goes to the periphery and gathers the stuff, because the stuff all just comes to me. And they're trying to do it. But it's insidious because you can't really get it all done as completely as you might like to. And there's a lot of middle level here holdouts against the idea of vernacular knowledge and what it means in a university. But I've argued to the provost that our future in making this an exemplary international university is by finally reconciling the inclusion of vernacular knowledge as available for comparativism, local analysis, and improvement of the conditions of all the folks. And he feels that way, I think, intellectually. Emotionally, I think it's harder for a career person who's been in sort of the brass finish world of economic theory to fully accept that inside his heart fully.
Yeah.
And I love him to death. He's the greatest guy. But I think we have these dialogues all the time of it, where I'm the active guy and he's like going to give me the critiques and support me, but I'm his transfer agent, rather than I want him to be the one who articulates it, and says, no, you got to do that.
Right.
So anyway.
Yeah. The way I've won those arguments at Yale is to say, well, if you don't have to understand this, but if you don't, just think of it as PR. This program is going to be great PR for the university, and that's all you need to know. Well,
and in a way that I think that having the show here, that's part of that same coin. I think the other thing is that literally the narrative of the university's potential collapse and the city's collapse and the recovery is what's generating 43,000 applicants. And even though our matriculation rate's only gone from high teens, low 20s to high 20s, low 30s, when you got 43,000 applicants, you kind of figure out who's going to come. I mean, and the metrics of these students is like through the roof now.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're probably smarter than all the faculty. And so in a funny way, we've succeeded and on those terms, but with another way of doing it. And the narrative has been this recovery and learn the culture. Mm-hmm. And, you teach them. I mean, I feel like the kids today, if I boiled it down, they want cowboys, Indians, blues. They want something they feel is sacred to them. They want some sense of community, and they want to feel like they're players. And they figure some of them worry about the money, but most of them just want to be happy. Feels like the 60s to me in a funny way, a little more purposeful, a little less focused maybe. But so I like being with the students.
Yeah.
They give me ideas and energy. We've pulled some in here. But I go up and down. I'm very mercurial emotionally about what success is and isn't, and maybe that's a measure of my immaturity, but maybe that immaturity has kept me fresh enough to keep an edge emotionally to do the show, and convey my feeling and convey what I do care about. So if you're going to be up and high and doing that, you also have to have your down points. And I'm not a good steady operator, bureaucrat, academic, or any of that. So I've failed in conventional terms, but I think it succeeds as art and as social activity.
Yeah. Is there anything you wish that we had talked about?
Well, I would like to. I really would like to read your books. I knew about Werner Soller's stuff, and I was interested in that over the years. And I'm more interested probably in the relation of Euro ethnics to African Americans, given the history of jazz and creolization as conventionally understood. And so maybe by the next time I see you, I could have read some more of that, and you could have seen more of the things I've worked on, and I could be more intelligently asking some of those questions. But I felt like today that it was good to talk about where you were hoping for to head, and to be able to find if we could quote something in that. And we'll get you the CD, and then we'll get a transcript to you, and we'll probably all be embarrassed by what we read on the page, and we'll edit the hell out of it. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That was great.
Good to see you.
That was great.
Good to see you.
That was great.
Good to see you.